Oh, sorry about that. Can you hear me now? Hopefully you can hear me now. Yeah, well, more bugs. Hopefully it's coming now. So, again, trying to work out the bugs. And so, anyway, here I am. Can you hear me? I hope you can hear me now, hopefully. Hopefully everybody's hearing me. Hopefully everybody's seeing me. And so, if you can hear me, give me a thumbs up. That's what they say when you're taking one of those e-class. Everybody's here, hopefully, and that you can see me and you can hear me. And, well, now seems like I've run into some problems again. So I'm not sure what's going on. So, well, hopefully I'm back on. I seem to be having some technical difficulties, and I keep disconnecting. My software keeps disconnecting, and I'm not sure what the problem is, but hopefully we'll be able to get through this in one fell swoop. Next week, we're trying to get Google Hangouts to work so we can do it in a way that's more interactive, and it's not just the chat feature, but we'll be actually able to speak to each other. Of course, this is being a problem, so I'm not sure that will be any less of a problem, but maybe it will be. Who knows? But anyway, I better get on with this before my stream disappears completely. Some of the problems are probably due to the fact that we have some issues with connection because of the fact that people have had some problems, or not some problems, but there's so many people at home and so many people online at one time that it's very difficult sometimes to keep the streaming going. So that probably accounts. Reading today Matthew 17, the end of the chapter, beginning with verse 22 and following, where you remember that Jesus is talking to Peter, and he's talking about the tax for the temple. And he says to Peter to go to the shore and to catch the first fish that comes, and there'll be a coin in his mouth. And so it got me to thinking about the fact that God is indeed, not only does he supply all our needs, but he always takes care of those issues for us. And I was looking at some of the things that are going on in the news, and the fact that there's a lot of folks that are having protests. Okay, well, I seem to have frozen again. And so I think that I froze again, and so again the connection is going to be spotty. So I think we're going to have to make this short, otherwise it's going to be a very frustrating matter for the people that are listening. But there's a lot of people out there that are complaining. You know, they're complaining about work conditions. They're complaining because supposedly they're putting their life on the line to serve, and so on and so forth. And it got me to thinking about that fact that, you know, the language of the world is complaint. And at a time when their services are so much needed, they're walking out on it. And so it got me thinking about, what if the fire department, what if the police did the same thing? What if the military, the folks that I work with on a daily basis, were doing that? Then what would happen if that were the case? And so it got me to thinking about the fact that in the church, we can't be complaining. We can't be complainers. We need to be people who give thanks. Ephesians 5:20, Paul talks about how we are to be giving thanks to God in all things through Jesus Christ. And so we need to be people of thanksgiving and not people of complaining. I know that sometimes it's easy to complain. I mean, things don't go well and we start complaining. Before you know it, it's sort of like a snowball. And we've been complaining and complaining and complaining. And so we need to ensure that we're not doing that. As I mentioned, God always provides. And this miracle of the coin in the mouth truly shows how God provides. It's an amazing miracle, really, when you think about it. The fact that I read a commentator who was saying that God had to prepare the fish had to swim to that spot, it had to be the first one that Peter caught, and then, or before that, somebody had to lose a coin in the lake, and the fish had to pick up a coin and be the first one that Peter hooked on. And I thought, well, that's obviously amazing, but there's also the fact that God may have provided or prepared the fish. He may have created the fish with the coin in its mouth, just like he created the fish that he gave to the people to eat when he multiplied the fish and the bread. But in any case, it's an amazing miracle, really, when you think about it. Truly, when you read those kinds of things, it can't help but strike you that with the fact that our God is an amazing God. And the miracles that are recorded for us in the New Testament truly give us comfort and help us to understand how amazing of a God he truly is. We are not told what happened. The story sort of ends abruptly, but it isn't necessary for Matthew to tell us what happened because it's obvious. If the Lord said that this was going to take place, then it took place. And again, a great comfort for us. The Lord has made some promises. He has told us certain things about how we are to conduct ourselves, how we are to trust him, to confide in him, and then we can have the assurance that all the things that he said he's going to do, he will do. None of it will fail. In 1 Peter 5, Peter says, probably remembering perhaps this instance where he said that we are to cast all our cares upon him, speaking of God and Christ, because he cares for us. In other words, he is going to provide for us all our needs. And again, I can't help but think of the fact that maybe he was thinking about this particular instance among the many others where the Lord provided so much. As I mentioned, the miracle of the fish is one that is, and the fish and the bread is one that, again, is pretty amazing. We've been talking about evangelizing, and the last week we spoke about discipling. We're continuing in our series on evangelizing and how we are to evangelize. And of course, as I mentioned last week, it's a little difficult now because we are having to have this social distance thing. But, we still need to do what we can. There's always social media. There's always the phone when we talk about our family. There's always email. There's always opportunities for us to use in one way or another. Some of us are working, although I just found out today that I'm off work until further notice. So again, I extend the invitation. If anybody has a need and I can go and help out, bring you some groceries or whatever, let me know, because now I'm home until further notice. Whenever this thing settles down, or whenever our society decides that we're going to go back to some semblance of normalcy. It is obvious that we cannot keep this up for the long term, but as to how long that will be is anybody's guess, obviously, until the Lord decides. So this week we're going to talk about dealing with objections. And obviously when you talk about evangelizing, there's a lot of objections that people bring up. And so it's important for us to sort of be prepared somewhat. Obviously the Spirit is going to help us, but it never hurts to be prepared, right? And so the first thing when it comes to attitudes is don't argue. Because a lot of times you get into arguments, and what happens is you end up going down a rabbit trail and not staying on point, so to speak. Make sure that you pray, obviously, and that's the first thing that you need to do. Try to anticipate objections when you make your presentation of the gospel. Think of the things that people may bring up, depending on who you're speaking to. You may be speaking with somebody you know, and you already know perhaps what their position is. And if that's the case, you may won't be able to answer some of those objections even before they bring them up. So understand also what the other side is thinking. That's very important. When you're an apologist, it's not only important to know what the truth of the gospel is, it's also important to know what other people are thinking and saying, because you'll be able to be more effective by speaking to those things and debunking some of those myths. Again, don't get sidetracked. That's important. Some objections are just smoke screen. And a lot of times people will try to bring up certain things to try to discombobulate you, as it were. So, stay on point. If it's a bona fide question, then deal with it honestly and forthrightly. If you don't know the answer, then tell the person you'll find out. That's a good thing about having 2 or 3 of you together, because a lot of times when one person doesn't know the answer, one of the other individuals or the other individual may. And so it's always good for you to go out with somebody who may be a little more experienced than you. And that way, between the 2 of you, hopefully, you'll know the answer. What are some of the common objections that people have? Well, there's, I don't believe the Bible. Well, you ask why. Point to things like prophecy, for example. Point to the reliability of the text. I mean, there's a lot of reasons that we should believe the Bible. That the Bible's reliable, that the Bible is true. And so appeal to those kinds of things. Now, obviously, we know that evidentialist ways of dealing with objections are not the best, but evidence does have its place. And there are times when it's important to use that evidence. If the person's an atheist, for example, then speak to the unreasonableness, the irrationality of being atheist, for example. And so in the end, the person may not listen or may not embrace your point of view, but at least you would make the case that the Christian religion is rational, that it is a reasonable faith, that it is the only reasonable faith, really, when you think about it. Obviously, when you're talking to somebody about the faith, you're not going to have time to examine all other religions, but it's not necessary. The person will have certain ideas and certain belief sets that you should address at that point, and so try to do that. Somebody may say evolution disproves the Bible. And again, the question needs to be why and then how. Because a lot of the folks that say these kinds of things, they don't really know. They just latch on to those kinds of ideas because they heard it somewhere, they read it on the internet, and it sounds good. And they don't want to believe, and so that's why they're going to believe. Some of the answers to that objection, the chances of life arising spontaneously are astronomically, and really they're zero. That such a thing is impossible when you think about it. If you think about it reasonably and rationally. It's never been observed. It will never be observed. And so the idea that is how life came into being is nothing but a myth. DNA cannot arise spontaneously for the simple reason that information cannot come from non-information. And DNA is information. The more we learn of science, the more we realize that life cannot have arisen by chance. For example, take Richard Dawkins and Francis Crick. Francis Crick was the person that mapped the genome, who should have known better after he did that, but nevertheless. Their idea was that extraterrestrials came and sowed humans on Earth, for example. Obviously, the question has to be, okay, well, where the extraterrestrials came from. So the idea is simply to try to eliminate God from the picture any way that you can, even if you're doing it in an irrational manner, as that idea would be. So another common objection is, I don't believe in God. And so again, ask why. And point to the fact that nature screams of God. Nature without God is an oxymoron. The laws of logic, morality, there are just too many things in the world that would make absolutely zero sense if there were no God. And so you can point to those things effectively to debunk those ideas. There's also the matter of cause and effect. Every effect has a cause, right? And the person might be like the little boy. He says, well, who made God, right? God is not an effect, therefore he doesn't need a cause. As God is the first and essential cause, then God does not need a cause. He is the first cause, the essential cause. There has to be a first cause. So again, and as one of you is saying in the chat, and that's absolutely true, God does not have to be proved. And so this is not what you're attempting to do. You're simply attempting to hopefully bring the person to a realization of how irrational they are being when they say that God does not exist. There's also the fact of personality, right? We have personality. Where did that personality come from? Where did the mind come from? And so, again, all of those things speak to the fact that there is a God, and he doesn't need to be proven. It is self-evident. So the God I believe in isn't the God of the Bible, right? It could be Allah, or it could be, well, when people use that objection, it's usually not because they're Muslims or because they're something else, Jewish, for example. Although the God of the Bible would be the God of the Jew, the God of the Old Testament anyway. But it's usually some form of, my God is too big for one religion to contain him, or something to that effect. Again, the first question needs to be why. How is your God? What kind of a God do you have? On what do you base that idea? Because, we base our belief, we base our value system on the Bible. But most people don't do so. They do so on, most people who have this objection is, well, I heard it somewhere, or that's just what I believe, or that's just what I think. Obviously, that is about the height of arrogance. People think themselves humble when in reality they are being arrogant by saying, hey, I am the determiner of what kind of God exists, when the reality is obviously different. There might be somebody who says, I don't believe in the resurrection. Again, why? It's one of the best attested events of antiquity. Christianity is the only evidential and historical religions in existence. There isn't another one. When you talk about Islam, for example, it all comes from one man, and an obscure one at that. When you talk about Buddhism or Shintoism, all of those things are dependent on one individual who at some point somewhere, and nobody is quite sure how, came into enlightenment in the case of Buddha, some of the other things that have to do with their particular system of beliefs. Yet Christianity is a time and place religion, a religion that appeals to time and place. Take 1 Corinthians 15, for example. Paul says if the resurrection did not take place, then Christianity is a sham. It is not something that is mythological. It is not something that we look back and say, well, once upon a time, somewhere, someplace, somebody did certain things. It is dependent on time and space. It is historical. And so we can have the assurance that it is a reasonable faith. Another objection might be, I don't believe in life after death. And again, why? Nature shows resurrection. The life and death cycle. What about ultimate justice? If there is an ultimate justice, then somebody's going to get away with it. Another one is after-death experiences. Now, that has limited applications, and I wouldn't go to it unless I absolutely had to, because the reality is that it's something that's very difficult to grasp, and a lot of folks, well, who knows whether what they saw was real, whether it was in their mind or whatever. But the reality is that there is life after death. Christ proved it, obviously, by coming back from the dead. And then the last objection may be something to the effect of, what about reincarnation? Hebrews 9:27 and 28 speaks to the fact that there's only one life. And then after that, the judgment. There cannot be perfection in this life, no matter how much we try. That idea of karma, you have to work your karma in subsequent iterations of life, is without foundation, because if somebody were able to do that, then there'll be somebody somewhere who has attained that state of affairs. Obviously, sinfulness is universal. Nobody but Christ could say, who convicts me of sin? And so that is patently and obviously and illogical and irrational to think. So in the end, we do these things not because the Spirit needs us. The Spirit doesn't need us, but God has ordained certain means by which He will bring the world to Himself. And so and the way that He is going to bring the world to Himself, His elect to Himself, is by the preaching of the Word. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, that's the point that Paul makes when he says that it pleased God through the foolishness of preaching to save those who believe. And so we preach not because God needs us, but because He has commanded it so, and because He has ordained it to be so. And we prepared because, as William Taylor said, in the work of winning souls, as in other departments of human activity, it is the hand of the diligent that maketh rich. Right? An old proverb that we need to be prepared because being diligent is pleasing to the Lord and will, in His time and in His way, bring about a harvest as He wills. So there you have it. Without God, everything is totally subjective, as somebody in the chat says, and that's absolutely right. It's a matter of preferences, not a matter of objective truth. Because without a God, then everybody is basically making their own rules, their own desires, their own whatever is right is whatever they say, and not what is absolutely true. Any question? If you have any questions and you're online, please put them in the chat. I will do my best to answer them. And so hopefully I look like my stream sort of stabilized after a while. So hopefully you've been able to see me and hear me without having too much frustration. So it was good for me, obviously. Hopefully it was beneficial for you. So I'll stop now, and if you have any questions, put them in the chat. I'll wait for a couple of minutes, as I did last week. As I mentioned, while you think of anything you may want to ask, next week we're going to try Google Hangouts. And some of you may be thinking, oh great, he's hardly had the YouTube thing worked out, and now he's going to try something else. But well, hopefully we'll get this done, and eventually we'll have it up and running on a consistent basis. The software will cooperate. There won't be 600 million people online at the same time, and so hopefully that will be the case. Somebody mentioned in the chat that God brings His elect to Himself and brings life to light via His Word, and that's absolutely right. Obviously, only through His Word. By the way, it is only through the preached Word, as Romans chapter 10, Paul spoke about. How will they know unless they hear? How will they hear unless somebody preaches to them? How will they preach unless they're sent? And so then he quotes from Isaiah about how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good tidings of great joy. Speaking of the gospel, a prophecy of the gospel. And so indeed, that is the way that God has desired to bring his people to himself. So I will be sending you an invite for the Google Hangout. And it's pretty simple. I was shown by someone recently how to do it, and it looks like it's pretty simple. Again, it's one of those things that sometimes when you think about the fact that it looks simple on paper, but then you go to try to do it, and it turns out to be a lot harder than it looks. But hopefully this time it'll work the right way. So I better be quiet and let you think of any questions you have. So I'll wait a couple minutes. I'm going to mute the mic. So it's not that I'm leaving or that the volume has gone away. It's just that I'm muting the mic so that way you'll take a couple minutes and hopefully think about any questions you may have. Somebody asked me about how much do I rely on evidence as typically when dealing with unbelievers. That's an interesting question because when I speak to people about the gospel, usually they don't give me a lot of those type of, for lack of a better term, scholarly objections. Usually the objection is, and this is probably 99% of what I run into. And I should have mentioned it too, but this gives me an opportunity to do that. I think I'm good enough. I think that I behave well enough. I think I'm a good person. And so I think that God will accept me because I'm a good person and so on and so forth. And so that's what I usually encounter. And the way that I deal with that is, it's talking to the person about what kind of person they truly are. In other words, have you lived a life that is perfect? Have you lived a life that it's completely upright? You have never sinned in your life, right? Because even if you were to live a perfect life from this point on, I know you can think of things you have done wrong in the past. How do you take care of those things? You can't trust in the fact that you may do enough good in the future. The criteria, the standard is perfection. It's not somebody else who may be good or may be okay, and so you compare yourself to them and you say, I'm better than that person, because that's a comparison we're always going to make. We're always going to find somebody that we think is worse than we are, and we're going to compare ourselves to that individual. But the comparison that we need to make is to God and to his perfection. And since none of us can attain to that standard, then we need somebody who can. And that somebody who can is only Christ. That's usually how I deal with it. Sometimes people, they say, you're right. Other times they go away and they still are trusting themselves for, being good enough. But again, it depends on what the Spirit has decided to do in the life of that person at that moment. Somebody asked me, when witnessing and that person keeps going down a rabbit hole, at what point do you stop, or should you continue to give them the gospel? That's a case-by-case basis, as I mentioned before. But make sure that somewhere in that conversation you give them the gospel. There might be a lot of questions the individual might have. And they might be good, bona fide questions that would be good for you to answer, because that might be an opportunity for you to clear a lot of the debris that person has accumulated in their mind up to that point. But somewhere along the conversation, you need to present to them the fact that they are sinners, that they stand condemned before God, and that only Christ is the only one who can give them relief, the only one that can make them acceptable in the sight of God. And so once you have done that, then answer as many questions as you can. But again, if they're answering some silly questions, then you have to make a determination that, this individual is really not interested in hearing what I have to say, so just cut it short. After you have given them the gospel, say, hey, maybe we could talk again soon. Hopefully you have some literature that you can give them where they can contact you if that is their desire. And then maybe follow up at some point if the person has seemed to be at least somewhat receptive to the message. But that's a difficult one, because a lot of times, and it's not that people necessarily are insincere or that they're trying to derail you from the things that they are saying, or from the things that you are saying rather, but they just have a lot of things on their mind, a lot of things that they've heard from other people, a lot of things they've read, they've heard, and so they see this as an opportunity to maybe clear some of those questions. And so you have to make that determination, and hopefully you can at that moment. Again, prayer is essential. You can pray. Use the example of Nehemiah. Remember when he goes before the king, he says, at that moment I prayed to the God of heaven. At the moment he's giving the cup to the king asks him a question, and before he answers, he prays. That's a great example right there. And so it's a challenge, but I think one that we can handle, and it takes practice a lot of times. I can think back of a lot of things where I can look back now and say, wow, I didn't really handle that very well. But it's a learning process, just like everything else. And so hopefully you can learn and do well in doing so. So, okay. Anything else? How do you deal with those who point to competing truth claims, e.g. Mormonism, Oneness Pentecostals, etc., etc.? If it is, like, for example, if I'm going to a door-to-door, let's say, and somebody says, well, what about Mormonism? What about this? What about that? I say, I present the gospel, first of all, and then I say, well, those are all very good questions. How about if we set a time where we can discuss these things more in depth, in a better setting, than just standing at somebody's door. And hey, the person might invite you in. And if that's the case, then take the opportunity to do so and to go in and to talk about those things. I think the first question for me would be, how much do you know about those things? Because that will determine how much in depth I go into those things. Because if somebody that's just saying, what about Mormonism? What about Jehovah's Witnesses? Which is one of the other ones that go door to door. Well, then my question will be, okay, what do you know about them? What do you know about their doctrine, and so on and so forth? And based on that answer, then we'll talk about those things. We can talk about Joseph Smith, for example, the kind of person he was, some of his so-called visions, the things that he wrote in the Book of Mormon, the fact that Mormons supposedly believe in the Bible, and yet they contradict it often, not only in the Book of Mormon, but in the Doctrine and Covenants and the Pearl of Great Price, the history of Mormonism, how Mormonism is basically a Johnny-come-lately. A lot of these religions are. How Mormonism compares, the Book of Mormon, for example, compares to the Bible. How, the archaeologically speaking, but not just archaeologically, but doctrinally as well. Jehovah's Witnesses, the same thing. Talk about Charles Taze Russell, where he came from, the beliefs of Mormonism or Jehovah's Witnessism, how that they are very closely related to Arianism. Mormonism, for example, nothing is new in that case. You have Origen in the 3rd century talking about the pre-existence of the soul. And so a lot of these things go back to a lot of the heresies that existed in the 1st century, which are just nothing more than basically rehash warmed over doctrines that have been refuted, that have been seen for the heresies that they are. So that would be my approach. Obviously, depending on how much the person has been programmed by these other cults, it may take a while to be able to sort through it all. But hey, if somebody is asking me about those questions, I'm thinking this is great, because it means that the person has interest. And so I want to follow up. I want to build that into a relationship where we can have several sessions to talk through those things. So that would be my approach. Okay. When do you personally feel it's time to kick the dust off and walk away? When a person who becomes nasty and tries to take you down to their level, does it become pearls before swine? Well, if the person's being nasty, obviously, that's not something you want to continue, because obviously there's no interest there. If the individual has been relegated to insults, or if they have certain objections that you answer, and what they resort to is insulting you because they can't answer your answers, then obviously it's time to cut bait, so to speak, and move on, realizing that individual, at least at that point, is not interested in the truth. So again, that's a determination you have to make, and hopefully, again, prayer is essential. Be praying while this individual is having their rant, and then say, well, it seems to me that you're not ready at this time to hear these things, and just leave the literature with them, and the Lord will work on his or her heart as he wills. Either the thing about evangelizing is that your job is twofold, and you do not determine which of those two things you're doing. God is the one that determines that. But you can either be convicting, your words can be convicting to an individual, or they can be condemning. So God may be convicting that person, and you may be sort of like a cog in that machine, one of many. You may be the first one, you may be the last one. You never know. Or you may be the one that God is using to convict or to condemn that person, to show that person why they stand condemned before him. And so bear that in mind. Bear in mind that it could be either one. And so because it could be either one, then we don't despair. We realize that sometimes it will be pleasant, sometimes not so pleasant, but God will determine. So a question about none that seeks God, none that seek after God, no, not one. Obviously, the Bible is always true. And so the way that I look at that passage is, in the totality of the scripture, is that nobody naturally seeks God. Nobody on their own seeks God. But once the Holy Spirit regenerates that heart, then a person becomes a God seeker. And so if an individual is a God seeker, a true God seeker, it's because the Spirit has regenerated the heart. It's because the Spirit has resurrected that individual, brought him to spiritual life. And so now he is seeking after God. And so now that process that will end in salvation by grace through faith has begun. And the interesting thing about that is that a lot of times we have a tendency to think that that's sort of like in a flash, but it's not necessarily the case. Sometimes it's a process. The person may be awakened spiritually today, and months down the road, finally, God grants repentance, grants faith, and the individual truly becomes justified. And so, again, I think that gives us great hope, gives us great comfort in continuing to do the work, because we know that God will do his work one way or another. And so hopefully that answers that question. Anybody else? This is good. I'm glad that we're interacting more. Last week we didn't have any interaction. I think that some of that was some of the technical issues and the fact that I didn't come on until about 15 minutes after the time that I was supposed to be on. So it wasn't entirely that people may not have wanted to. It was just some of that was that issue there as well. Again, let me remind you, if you have prayer requests, please send me an email. I had just one last week, but if you have any, please send them to me. I will make sure that I will send them off to the whole church. And so, and by the way, there's one that I need to be reminded of here in a little while, so I will send that out to everyone. I think I sent something out about it, but I have to remind myself whether I did or not. And so, well, if that is all, I hope that, again, you have found it beneficial, and looking forward to hopefully being able to see you, at least virtually, next week. And, again, we have to trust in our God. We know that everything He does is right, and that whatever this situation is, whenever the situation ends, it will be by His will, and it will be to His glory and to our benefit. And so, hope that you have a good evening. Let's close with a word of prayer, and we'll go ahead and end on that. Our Father in heaven, thank you so very much that you have seen fit to, again, be with us tonight. Thank you that we were able to work through the technical issues, and that the folks that tuned in hopefully were able to benefit from the study.